Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lords of Limited. My name is Ben Warney, and joining me on the line, as always, Mr. Ethan, Hour of Victory Sachs. Ethan, sometimes it is your hour of victory, sometimes it's not. Both of us ran cold in the Arena Open today.
I should have known. I should have known because I was one and done yesterday with my bullets. It never goes well. I feel like when that happens, like I didn't have to grit and bear it yesterday to make it through bullet 3, 4, 5, whatever. So today I woke up. I was like, it's a free roll, whatever. And we'll check out my draft in a little bit because I think it's pretty interesting. But it just sort of dried up. I think I had a good pack one, and then it all went downhill from there. What's your excuse? What happened with you?
My draft was a little underpowered, and then I ran colder than the sun. It was one of those days where, like, you think, well, I hope this doesn't happen, and then X happens. Like, I hope I don't draw 2 more lands after I keep this hand, and you draw 2 more lands. Or I needed my Wicker Folks to surveil lands to the bottom, and instead I had already drawn my lands and hit my spells. So my Wicker Folks were basically 1/3 flyers, or they showed up on turn 5, or my opponents just ran hotter than the sun with some rough splashes. Although, to add insult to injury, in the last round I played out for the gems. I went 1-2 drop, but I didn't actually drop. I played the last round for gems, and I just got absolutely destroyed by Engine Rats and Silken Strengths. Just like I just crushed. I was so off it after the last round. Like my removal was Flood the Engine, and my opponent was main decking double Silken Strength to untap the creatures from Flood the Engine. And then I got by a Silken Strength on an Engine Rat to kill one of my larger flyers. It's not my day.
Wow. I mean, I know you and I came around on Engine Rat pretty quickly. Where are you at on Silken Strength these days?
I don't like it. It's not. I mean, it was great against me. Like, it's fine if you're playing big dumb monsters, but I think your green deck should probably have better card quality than Silken Strength on average.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of bringing it in against Flood the Engines or maybe some damage-based removal, or obviously against flyers, maybe if you can't beat them. But it doesn't seem like something that green needs to main deck, like especially when you have Ketrodons and Hazard of the Dunes running around. Like, are you really that soft to flyers? I don't know. I'm not crazy about Silken Strength. I am pretty crazy about Engine Rat these days, and I know you are too, Mr. Pack 1 Pick 2 in the Arena Open.
I mean, it's a good card. I wouldn't have thought it at the start of the format, but it does line up well.
So we are going to check out my Arena Open Day 2 draft log today. I think there's a couple interesting spots, some different paths that we'll chat about, and then just want to check in on the format. You know, we did a lot of draft logs, PT review, MagicCon Chicago review last week, and haven't quite gotten to touch back in on the format, so just want to check in on a bunch of individual cards and perhaps a niche deck that I know I've been pretty hot on for a while, and I know you are now very hot on as well, and we're going to dive deep on that archetype as well. But before we get into any and all of that, let's chat about the Patreon page. Patreon.com/Lords of Limited is where folks can go to give back to the show if they so choose. We got some great perks over at the Patreon. First thing is access to the Lords of Limited Discord. I love checking in on the Discord during Arena Open Week, seeing people make it to day 2, seeing people make it to draft number 2, and probably once we log off, or I guess while I'm editing later this afternoon, I'll get to check in and see which folks in our Discord are making their push for $500, $1,000, and $2,000 as a top prize. That's super awesome. We have a ton of previews rolling in. Someone dropped in that not only do we have Tarkir Dragonstorm previews, we've got some Final Fantasy previews, and then we're like, oh, should we start a Spider-Man preview channel? I was like, let's just pump the brakes on chatting about a set that's gonna be 3 sets away from now as my anxiety creeps in. But the Discord is awesome. People are hungry to chat about Magic, and we love that community over there. And I also want to shout out that our Patreon also offers access to a podcast feed, which gives you the episode a day early, ad-free, and our weekly bonus episode of Lords Unlimited, which we're offering every Thursday. So if any or all of that sounds of interest to you, head on over to the Patreon page. We want to shout out our new patrons the first week that they join. This week, we're welcoming Tobin, Mike, Jerry, Quinn, and Franz. Thank you. We really appreciate your support.
Yeah, cannot say thank you enough. All right, take me through this open day 2 draft.
Okay, so pack 1, pick 1. You got a cup of coffee in hand, or I guess Diet Mountain Dew in your case, and you sit down and see the following cards as options. The commons, there's a Pothole Mole, there's a Grim Bauble. Best common, I think, is Ride's End, the 4 and a white exile thing, and it's 3 less to cast if it targets a tapped permanent. In the uncommons, really one jumps out to me, which is Gastel Thrillseeker, black red for a 2/3 with Start Your Engines. When it enters, it deals damage to target opponent and you gain a life, and its max speed payoff is it has Death Touch and Haste. There's a Legoran, the green-white 1/1 flyer with Saddle 1. There's a Tarian World Tyrant, 2 triple green for a 9/7. And your rare is Culloden Triumph Caster, red-white for a 2/3. Mounts and vehicles you control have haste. Whenever a mount you control enters, it becomes saddled until end of turn. And whenever a vehicle you control enters, it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn.
Yeah, both you and I had some pretty disappointing pack one pick ones in the Arena Open, and yours is hard. Like, there's a lot of options here, but none of them particularly great. I think for me, it comes down to the Thrill Seeker, the red, black, gold uncommon versus Ride's End, which is kind of crazy because if you told me a week ago that I'd be taking Ride's End over Grimbauble, I would have told you were nuts. But Grimbauble has just kept going down and down and down for me. It's just not a card versus the green decks, which is a pretty big problem in the format.
Yeah. Whereas Ride's End is a very good card against the green decks and is quite splashable.
Yeah, well, I'm also just kind of coming around on white the last week as well. Since I got back from Chicago, I've been playing exclusively best of 3. And white decks have been impressive in best of 3 because it's a more realistic picture of the format because green's a little bit more contested, maybe not quite as it was today in the Arena Open. And then white does have cards that let you go big. It can kind of tussle with the green decks, especially if you're picking up the Ride's Ends. And also, I think complements green pretty well, too. Like, if green is cut, usually white's wide open, and then you could maybe make some sort of a green-white large monsters deck, too.
Yeah, for sure. We have a point about this a little later on, but we can chat about it now. Where are you at with starting with gold cards in the format? Because, like, if you look at the 17 lands game and hand win rate, like a lot of the top uncommons, maybe the top 4 or 5, are gold cards. But I'm quite reluctant to pick gold cards early in the format myself.
That's how I feel as well. I really want to try to feel it out and find my lane because I think if you do find the right lane, you get pretty hooked up. Like either green is open and you draft a great green deck, or if you find one of those Grixis color pairs that's open, like I think those decks can really hang with the green decks.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that sentiment is interesting because it's going to be contrary to what I did here, which is I did take the Thrill Seeker, but I think both cards are on the table for me. Like, I think it's extremely close personally. And I just thought I wanted to get, like, it was likely for me to get into red black more than many other decks. And I figured Thrill Seeker's a great reason to do that. And nothing else. I didn't know. I think I felt more confident about how to proceed in the draft with Thrill Seeker in my pile than how to proceed in the draft with Ride's End.
Right. That's what you're weighing, right? So it's a gold card, but it is the gold card in the color pair you're most likely to navigate your way into naturally.
Correct.
Also, right? Like if this were, what if this is
Sky
Serpent?
I'm taking Ride's End, honestly.
That's what I think too, yeah. But that's the interesting point for the audience, and just to think about drafting with preferences and all that sort of stuff. That's why you're taking a gold card, because you navigate to black red so often by yourself.
Yeah, I think this might be the only, like, I could think about all the green ones like Veteran Beast Rider or the Brood Wagon, like all of those. I think I'm taking Ride's End over them, just because I'm like, there is a bit of, maybe I'm gun shy and I shouldn't be. Like, someone at the table has to draft green, or 3 people at the table have to draft green, whatever. But the green cards I'm less excited about. Thrill Seeker specifically, I am pretty excited about.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you. What is, so Tarian's here, right? And I think both of us are not interested in taking Tarian. If Tarian is migrating Ketradon, or take your pick, Hazard of the Dunes, whichever one you think is better. Is there a green common you're taking over Thrill Seeker?
That's really tough.
I know it's hard, right?
I think, I don't know. I really don't know. It would have to be a game time decision, because like I'm thinking I might still take Thrill Seeker, but it's even closer for me. Like Ketradon, I think, is a no. Hazard of the Dunes, I think, should be a yes.
Yeah.
But that's really hard. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very hard pick. You want, like, that was my hope coming into the Arena Open, was that I either would just get a great green card to where I knew, okay, I'm going to take some green cards and then I'm going to figure it out, or like something really good of something not green, so I could just never think about green all draft, and I kind of neither one of those things happened. My draft was just pretty underpowered. But the other thing that I think that is interesting about this pick or this pack, or there's some people I'm sure who would take Tyrion and
Yeah.
try to be green. I think that's also a reasonable route to take.
Is it? Is that a reasonable route? Taking a triple green 5-drop? Is that really like I would think that's a mistake personally.
Well, it depends on how hard you subscribe to green's the best color. I mean, somebody's got to draft green. So by taking Thrill Seeker here, you're basically saying, I'm not going to draft green. Yeah? Like, how good does the next green card have to be for you to take a green card over a good black or red card? Like, if there's
It's got to
Hazard
be
of the
really good.
Dunes, Spin Out, Lightning
It's
Strike,
got
you're
to be
taking
like
one of the...
Greenbelt Guardian
Yeah,
levels of good probably.
right.
Like it's probably
Which is
not happening.
less likely to happen. So, I mean, I think there's something to be said for taking Tyrion and trying to cut green, as it were, or shoot your shot to try to get into green because this pack is medium or
Mhm.
whatever. Like, I don't think it's crazy to take Tyrion here. I would not. And I think for
Yeah.
me, I would have ended up, we were talking about this pre-recording, I think I would have ended up on Ride's End here
Mhm.
because I like red black. I like red black a lot, but I'd be a little nervous about first picking Thrill Seeker, especially because LR did their episode this week on red black and start your engines. Like, that would make me a little gun shy.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I didn't know that, and then I sent you my deck, and I was like, So spoiler alert, I ended up with no Hour Victories and no Risen Necro Regents, and I was like, where were those? And you were like, yeah, LR did you dirty. They spoiled the deck for you. But we were talking about this weeks ago.
We were.
And then the draft sort of then diverges pretty naturally, I think, between those two directions. So pack 1, pick 2. I don't think there are any commons in consideration. The uncommons, there's a Tarion again. There's a Road Rage, the single red deal X, where X is 2 plus the number of mounts and vehicles you control. And Detention Chariot, the 4 white white 6/6 vehicle that exiles a non-land permanent and has cycling for single white.
Yeah, so I think for you with your black, red, gold card, it's a very clear road rage. If you take the white card first, if you take rides, then you take detention chariot here. And this is the kind of white start I like if you're going to draft white, where you get like good removal spell into white chonkers. Like white can really compete with green's beef, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then pack 1, pick 3. Again, like 3 distinct options for the paths. If you're on the double Tarian life, there's a Stampeding Scurryfoot for you, the single green 1/1 with exhaust 3 and a green, put a counter and make an elephant. For Ben, there's a Broadcast Rambler, 4 and a white 5/4. When it enters, makes a 1/1 Thopter and has a crew cost of 1. And for me, there's a Grease Wrench Goblin, the single red 2/1 with exhaust 2 and a red, discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards and put a +1/+1 counter on this creature.
Yeah, I mean, no real decisions here. It's got to be Grease Wrench Goblin for you.
Mm-hmm. And then pack 1, pick 4 is tough. I mean, it's a bounty of options for me. There's a Spin Out in the pack, 1 black black, destroy a creature vehicle. In the uncommons, there's 3 for me to choose from. 1 is Apocalypse Runner, 2 black red for a 6/5 vehicle with crew 3, and you can tap it to have target creature you control with power 2 or less gain lifelink until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. There's a Wretched Doll, 1 and a black 3/1 with black tap surveil 1, and End Rider Spike Spitter, 3 and a red 3/4 reach, start your engines, and max speed. Payoff is at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn.
Okay, we got to back up, mister. I went to school for talking. You just said wretched doll instead of wretched doll.
Wretched Doll. It feels so weird to say wretched. I'm like, am I in a Shakespeare play? What's going on here? There you go. Wretched Doll.
Wretched doll. You love to hear it. So I think for you, knowing that you have the Thrill Seeker, like you want the start your engines payoffs. I don't think you can afford Spike Spitter to not wheel, and there's no way
Right.
Spike Spitter's wheeling in a pod this competitive. So while I would like to have Spin Out, you've already got a piece of interaction in Road Rage. Red Black is the archetype where you get the most interaction, I think, or have the most chances at interaction. So I like Spike Spitter here. I think it's definitely Spike Spitter over the other 2 cards, and it's basically whether you want Spike Spitter or removal. And I think Spike Spitter does the trick here. And then if you're me, if you get the 3 white cards, you take Spin Out. And I think I end up black-white in your seat, which, spoiler, doesn't work out much better for me than it does for you.
Yeah. Pick 5, I get a Mutant Surveyor, the 2 and a black 2/3 that has 2 to pump it and max speed. A Lightning Strike, pick 6. And then pick 7, I think if I could go back, I would have made this pick differently. There's a crash and burn, 3 in a red, choose 1, destroy target vehicle, or deal 6 to a creature or planeswalker versus an Apocalypse Runner, the black-red vehicle that we saw a few picks ago. If I could go back, I would take crash and burn in the spot, especially because, not because Apocalypse Runner wasn't good in my deck, but the other one wheeled. And so I ended up with 2, and I played both. They were fine. I ended up splashing a Transit Mage pretty easily, and it was nice to be able to Transit Mage tutor up one of the runners. Like, the runners were very good, especially in conjunction with the Mutant Surveyor that I had. Like, I was able to body someone by just going like unblockable pump. I ended up with the red uncommon exhaust creature as well. That's a 2/3 that has exhaust, put a counter on it, and it gains double strike. So getting that in for 6 points of unblockable lifelink in a turn was nice. Like, Apocalypse Runner was good in my deck, but the spin out that we passed pick 4 and the crash and burn here, those were my 2 chances at getting removal that could kill a migrating Ketrodon. And
But
I
that's
didn't.
unlucky, right? Like, so we should take a look at your draft. So pick 8, you also get a Mutant Surveyor. So at the end of the first 8 picks, here's your pile: Grease Wrench Goblin in the 1-drop slot. That's the 2/1. Road Rage, Gastel Thrill Seeker, and Lightning Strike in the 2-drop slots. Double Mutant Surveyor in the 3s. End Rider Spike Spitter as a Start Your Engines payoff in the 4. Plus an Apocalypse Runner. If you told me that was going to be my first 8 picks in the Arena Open, I would be like, yes, amen. Like, sign me up. I would draft that 10 out of 10 times in the Arena Open.
I felt very good at the end of pack 1. I noticed, like, I tanked on the spin out pick. I tanked on the crash and burn pick. Like, I was aware that those were pivotal picks, or those were close decisions for me. And yeah, I agree. Got unlucky to not get the catch-all removal. Like, I ended up with an Outpace Oblivion. That was the biggest way, and unfortunately 5 damage does not
equal 6.
Yeah. 5 does not equal 6. Migrating Ketchodon was tough for me to overcome. Yeah, pack 2 and pack 3 did not go nearly as well as pack 1 did for me, unfortunately. It's tough to know what happened. I mean, I guess I passed some black and red. Like, the packs were full, and so maybe someone moved in on my left and someone opened something on my right. I don't know. But yeah, did not go well. I played 3 games in all of my matches, but did not make it to draft number 2.
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, certainly that start you had was amazing. You just got kind of crushed by packs 2 and 3.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Who's your support system, and how have they changed your life?
It can often feel like society glorifies doing things on your own and not needing to rely on anyone. It's easy to forget that we're all better when we have a support system behind us.
I can definitely get trapped in that mindset a lot, whether it's with work, feeling isolated, editing or streaming, me against the negative comments, whatever, or even with taking care of Jonah, like not wanting to ask others for help when I know I really need it. And I'm lucky to have a great support system. I just need to use them more often.
Therapy can be a source of support for any area of your life. It's time to shift the focus from doing it all to knowing that we're better when we ask for help.
If you're thinking of starting therapy, BetterHelp is fully online, affordable, and convenient, serving over 5 million people worldwide.
Access a diverse network of credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties, and easily switch therapists at any time at no extra cost.
Build your support system with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lords to get 10% off your first month.
That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lords. And now, back to the show. But I think one of the interesting things too, just to chat really quickly about LR, they talked about Start Your Engines this week, and Paul was talking about green being great, and at the Pro Tour, a lot of times there are 4 or 5 green drafters at a table, still right to draft green, that sort of thing. And I'm totally on board at this point that green's very good. But the one thing that I think is interesting that they were talking about, or that Paul was talking about, and I think Paul's amazing, was that the other decks are so reliant on uncommons that he's reluctant to go into them draft in and draft out, like to steer towards blue-red, for example. Like that was the deck he kept bringing up. And I think I want to push back against that a little bit, because I think the shift that it seemed like he hasn't made yet that we've made, and I do think we're right about it, is that uncommons matter. And like uncommons are where it's at, and you see so many more uncommons in play boosters. So like, in a normal draft booster pack, if a deck relies on uncommons, I think it's not going to get there. But in the play booster era, those decks that are juiced by uncommons, I think decks primarily, if you look at them, have like close to equal numbers of commons and uncommons, the good ones at times. So I think if you find the right lane, you're likely to get rewarded. And yeah, sometimes you get bricked by the packs or whatever. But I think uncommons are where it's at these days.
Yeah, I think it's less about like uncommons matter and more that like that's latter point you made of gone are the days where your deck is like 15 commons or whatever. Like I just looked through my deck that I ended up with. I ended up with only one rare, but also only 10 commons. And I think that's actually kind of high. Like a lot of those cards, I'd be like, yeah, it would be nice if if our victories or risen necro regions make their way to me, then you're like taking out your end rider catalyzer or your walking sarcophagus, whatever. And like, I don't think that's crazy then to think that your commons are in the single digits and then your uncommons are the bulk, the majority of your deck. And I think that's true. I think that is the play booster thing. And so I just don't think that that sentiment matters. I agree with you that like, yeah, sure, blue red doesn't really exist at common. That's okay.
Right. That's my point. Yeah. That's what I wanted to get out into the world here.
Speaking of other content, I wanted to shout out. I'd been aware that this existed, like leading up to I think every arena open. Neo MTG, who aka Mark, who does the set reviews with Alex Unlimited level ups, he hosts a call with like top players before every arena open. This time it was DeFore, Jason Yee, and Scotty Nada, who is just dominating the best of three trophy leaderboard. And they just like sort of hash it out. I know the past guests, he's had Sam Black there, he's had Kyle Rose, aka Ham, and like a lot of just top players there. And I don't know what I was doing that I think maybe it was like because I bought so much time from only having to do, you set aside like a 5-hour block on Saturday of like, this is my arena open time. And then when I only had to do the one run, I had some time, so I fired it up, and I really enjoyed it. It's a good conversation. It's for just a sort of loose format call that is not edited at all. I was telling Mark was like, how did it read as content? I was like, it's like podcast adjacent, like it's not quite polished, but it's still, I found it to be really good. And a lot of the cards that they touched on are cards that I want to talk about here because I feel like my experience this week, plus hearing some of them talk about these individual cards, sort of started to coalesce some ideas for me. But that's available. I think it's just like in a Google Drive. So if you're on social media, go find Mark. We'll maybe put a link to it in the show notes if you want some more, high level discussions of the format. I think it's a good listen.
So two thoughts here. Thought one, I was actually watching Scotty Nada's stream as this was happening. I've been super sick all week. And so Scotty was streaming it. And Neo, Mark, absolute professional, was just like filling time because he was like, well, Ben is always late. We've had some other cancellations. Like maybe I'll reach out to someone else so we get up to 4 or 5. And I was thinking like I could volunteer here, but I just felt like garbage. So I just stayed in the shadows. But he was awesome. Like loved listening to him talk. And I chilled for the first 10 or 15 minutes of it, then went to bed. And the other thing, before we dive into some individual card discussions here, I have some life equity, I think, for myself for the Arena Open that might be applicable to other people. So
Yeah.
the Arena Open is a dual-headed beast for me on day one, where like obviously you just want to get into day two as quickly as possible. It's like sometimes it's time, but also there's the feel bads of like firing off $25 in a chunk, like if you're doing best of one every entry. And so usually I'm crunched on time to qualify. So I play best of one, but I've also just been doing best of one out of habit because, well, it's the highest percentage way to try to qualify,
Yes.
But in best of three, you do get a lot more gems back. And so I queued up in best of one at first and promptly lost to best of one things. And I was like, this doesn't feel the same way at all that playing the sealed PTQ stuff did. I'm going to play traditional. And I did traditional once and went 2-2, and you get like 3,000 gems back or whatever. So it doesn't feel quite so bad. And then when you do queue ultimately in traditional, you get the qualification plus 6,000 gems. And like I knew that there was more gem equity in best of three, but I had time. So it was much more relaxing to try to qualify, like not bleeding $25 an attempt, since I had time all day. So like ultimately I was only down $25 or something because I got into my third attempt, but and I guess I would only be down 50 in best of one. But I think in the future, if I have time on Saturday, I think I'm going to play traditional from now on.
Just to be clear, you get 5,000 gems from best of one if you
When
go 7
you
wins. Yeah.
do you?
Yeah. So it's not like, but you're right that like the progressive, because you have to get to, I don't know, I think it's 5 wins before you get any gems back in the best of one day one, whereas the best of 3 you do get more. So yeah, you're right. Like it's best of one, you have a higher percentage of actually qualifying, but if you care about gems, you should definitely be doing best of 3.
Yeah. So anyway, that was the first time I'd really experienced that for myself. So maybe other people are interested in that.
Ready to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make eating well easy. They're dietitian approved and ready to heat and eat in 2 minutes so you can fuel right and feel great no matter what life throws at you.
I recently got our Factor order for this podcast, and it was delicious. I said it was chef's choice for what meals to send me, and in the comments I put that I liked plain food, and it was perfect. There was like some salmon, there was a lot of broccoli, a lot of cauliflower rice stuff. I had a beef burger. It was right up my alley. It was like they knew me.
You love to see it. Factor arrives fresh and fully prepared, perfect for any active, busy, or bland lifestyle. And with 40 options across 8 dietary preferences on the menu each week, it's easy to pick meals tailored to your goals.
Choose from preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Plus, Factor can help round out your entire day with wholesome smoothies, breakfast, grab-and-go snacks, and more add-ons.
Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that can't be beat. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping.
It's Factor Podcast at factormeals.com/factorpodcast to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. And now, back to the show.
So I just want to go through a list of cards that'll help us, talk about the format a little bit more. Cards we've touched on before for sure, but that I think, finally wrapped my head around a bit. And the first is Bounce Off, the single blue bounce a creature or vehicle. And this, it's been top of the charts in the 17 lands game in hand win rate. I think one of the highest rated cards among top players for sure, or highest rated commons, I should say. And I think I finally get this card. One of the things that DeFore was talking about in the meeting that Mark hosted was that and it's so hard for me to I really can't. I'm are you trolling when you talk? What are you trying to get everyone to put 5 bounce offs in their deck so then you can beat them? I don't know, but he's just wild. But I appreciated him talking about this card because he was the games go long in the format. And so, yeah, you're down a card when the dust settles. But if you have enough card advantage in your deck, which a lot of decks do, you'll eventually make up what you lose. And so many games, because, and I hadn't quite, I had sort of been feeling this, but hadn't been able to put it into words, that because a lot of the games go long, it doesn't actually mean that card quantity matters, which is what I would often think, that okay, the game's going long, so who ends up with more resources when the dust settles? Who's drawn 2 or 3 more cards than the other person? It's often that a few cards matter is what it is. And Bounce Off helps that. Not only does it help protect your own stuff when you're just hey, instead of tapping out for my Earth Rumbler on turn 5, I'll wait till turn 6, play Earth Rumbler, and now I have my Bounce Off to protect it. But the other thing is that it plays so well against the green decks, because the green decks are removing your creatures with the run over and plow through and Bounce Off, much again, sort of deja vu. Took me too long to figure this out in Bloomburrow, that Into the Floodmaw was very good for a similar reason, because green's way to interact, and green was great in that format, but it was fight spells and bite spells. And how do you blow them out? Well, what are they going to do when you just keep up single blue the whole game? So I feel I finally get it. I'm not quite at the levels of running 2 or 3 copies of the card, but I am finally at 1 copy in basically every blue deck.
And this is just a broader conversation. I do like Bounce Off as well. I was doing day 1 yesterday with my brother. We were on Discord just hanging out or whatever, and we had a red-green build, and I had a Pedal to the Metal in the deck. And there was some other card he wanted to play. My brother is very risk averse, and there was some other card he wanted to play that was just a creature, power and toughness. He's Mr. Quadrant Theory, LR. Let's get high floors to our cards.
Amen. I love that.
the thing about Bounce Off or Pedal to the Metal or something is those cards give you ways to outplay your opponents in a way that a 4 mana 3/4 doesn't, or even a 3 mana 3/3 or something doesn't. So like the first couple effects of that type that you put in your deck give you a lot in like key spots in the game, like when it comes down to a key turn. Like Pedal to the Metal was rotting in my hand the whole game one time, and he was like, look, this Pedal to the Metal is terrible, like until it wasn't, and I domed my opponent out from nowhere with Pedal to the Metal in a game I otherwise couldn't have won with just some random creature. And Bounce Off is that same way. And then the other thing that you get from that is that once you've played it once, even if it's not in your hand and you're leaving up single blue in best of 3, like your opponent's gotta respect it as the
Yeah.
green player, which is also really powerful in a way that's hard to quantify, you know? And like you don't
Yes.
get that in best of 1, but in this arena open stuff, like those kinds of things matter a lot.
Yeah. And similarly, and you talked about this last week and in your vlog, which is up on our YouTube channel, about Defend the Rider being
Ugh,
key
do we
for
have to
you.
talk
I
about
know.
this card?
Well, like I think that story helped to solidify. Like I think I ran it for the first time this week, and
Oh,
Bounce Off
Defend the
as
Rider is
well.
incredible.
Well, I just haven't played that much green because
Sure.
I like doing the start your engine stuff, blah blah blah. But like, it's the same deal where like, okay, I'll play my Earth Rumbler with 6 mana. I'll play my Ketradon with 7 mana, or whatever the thing is that I'm gonna play. I'm gonna make sure that I feel like these cards, because they're cheap, they make me think that I have to be like getting ahead on tempo, and so then I only want to be aggressive with them. But honestly, the way they've played out this week has been the reverse. And what you're talking about with Pedal to the Metal, that like there's this patience game that I think this format specifically affords, because it's a much slower format, a much grindier format, that these 1 mana plays, you end up having time for them. And what you're talking about of like, it helps you outplay your opponent, like being able to just time that card for the blowout. And I've had the other thing of like being able to surprise pilot to crew something, like any of that stuff, like those cheap blowouts that you have to be patient for, you have to pick your spots for, can really leverage a lot of not only tempo but just wins in the format.
Yeah, and then just remember to not tap out of your Defend the Rider after you've played off curve the whole game to keep it up.
Yes. Well, but when your opponent says pass the turn, they're done. They're not
They're
allowed to
done.
take any actions
No
that
more
game.
actions after that point.
Spectral Interference. 1 in a blue, counter a creature or vehicle unless they pay 4. Have you played much of this format?
I have not, but it's been very good against me when my opponents have played it.
And it's very good. This was something Scotty was talking about in the call. It's very good against the green decks. It's a clean answer to Hazard. It's a clean answer to Ketradon, Earth Rumbler, whatever. The like green decks are tapping out on turns 4, 5, 6, 7. You know, like you're gonna get something, and certainly stopping the ETB from some vehicles or the Ketradon to gain 4, whatever. And that's a card that I haven't played that much either. I feel like it gets edged out because a lot of my blue decks are so synergistic in the format, right? Like if you're blue-white, how do I have room for this? If you're blue-red, I need the cycling, I need the this, I need artifacts. Like it's hard to find room for it, but I'm wondering with how much I was happy with it in sealed, leading up to the Arena Open, I wonder if I shouldn't be thinking about it a bit more in draft as well.
Well, but it's so tough because if you're not playing against green, it gets significantly worse, I think. Like a lot of the synergy decks. I guess it still nabs artifacts. I don't know.
It's a card that I have my eye on going forward, of just like, maybe I think I've mostly written it off because of that in draft of like, and I think now I kind of maybe want to just bump it up a little bit more, think about it as good interaction. Certainly want to have access to it out of the sideboard against green decks, etc.
It's so funny. You and I are basically the same person. We started show notes for this episode separately, and our show note sketch separately was almost identical. Like when I like ported mine over here, like you had a list of cards. I had almost all of these cards on my list as well, plus more cards from my list. And this next card was one of the ones that was on both of our lists. It's Marshall's Path Cruiser. This is 3 mana for an uncommon vehicle. It's a 6/5. It's got a crew cost of 5. And when it enters, you search your library for basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. And it's got exhaust for Wooburg, where it becomes an artifact creature and you put 2+1/+1 counters on it. If you basically just ignore the Wooburg exhaust and just view this as like 3 mana chunky vehicle that searches up a basic, it's going to help you splash. the card is gigantic and it's very good defensively. Like it's hard to attack into it profitably, even as the green decks, because like it trades with your Ketrodons, whatever. But it's also just a terrible card that you don't want to trade with. Like it's got keyword crappy, like back from the Brian Wong LR days.
No, it's so true. Like, and the real thing is that what you're saying about bad for the green decks, but it gives the non-green decks a way
Ways to
to
splash.
tussle with, well, ways to splash, but ways to tussle
Oh,
with
yeah.
Ketrodon,
For
right?
sure.
You get like your blue-black deck that has a bunch of like little derps. It's like, I have Thopters, I die to Ketrodon. No, now you have a 6/5. Yeah, I
Right. You
totally
don't have to
agree.
line up double blocks and cross your fingers. Like you can just animate Path
Right.
Cruiser if they have a trick. Great. Sure, my Path Cruiser's down.
And so I do think like you have to make some, if your deck is a bunch of Thopters and Rats or whatever, like maybe don't play Path Cruiser. Like if you're gonna struggle, if you have to chain 3 creatures together to crew 5, then maybe your Path Cruiser doesn't belong in your 2-color deck. But otherwise, I think I do play it without splashing. And if you are splashing, it's a no-brainer to include.
Well, and the other place that's really nice, this is an archetype that I don't know that we've certainly not talked about, and I don't know that I've really heard other people talk about, other content creators, but definitely is a deck that I've played against this week a ton now that I've been playing best of 3, which is Big White. And like this is amazing in white decks that want to go bigger and then splash, like your base white splashing good cards from the other colors, and you're playing like Path Cruisers, and you're playing the 5/4 vehicle that makes a 1/1 Thopter, and you're playing Rides
Well,
Ends, that sort of thing. This card is amazing there.
Well, I'll tell you who has been championing these kinds of decks is our dear friend Samp from the Lord's Limited Discord. But he has a very affectionate term for these decks that I won't say on air because it will give us an explicit rating. But Esper or Mardu piles is what he is affectionately, a word before pile, as he is affectionately coined these decks. And he's been a big fan of them, like has loved Rides End for a long time. And I think Rides End and I think the Rambler, the 5/4, that gives white a lot of juice, and a card that he's been high on that I think you and I are now high enough on is Starting Column is so good in those decks. The 3 mana rock with Start Your Engines, and then max speed payoff is just tap, sack it to draw 2, discard a card. Like,
Yeah,
so
Starting
good in
Column
those decks.
is really juicy. I was asking Sam at Chicago. I was like, okay, so when's the podcast starting? What, like for somebody who like thinks about
I
Magic as much as he
know.
does, plays as much Magic as he does, a podcast is right there. It's waiting.
Another card I want to talk about in conjunction with the Path Cruiser is Guidelight Matrix. This is the 2 mana artifact ETB draw card, and you can pay 2 tap to crew a vehicle or saddle a mount. This card does a lot of small things that, like, I think if you're checking enough of the boxes, like I'm not close to saying this is like golden egg territory, but I've had decks where it checks a lot of boxes and it really helps those decks become greater than the sum of their parts. Now, it's also just great if you got a Path Cruiser, having 2 mana to crew that is just awesome, not having to worry about the crew 5. But like, it triggers Pactol Terror. It makes your Haunt the Network. It's sitting around for your Haunt the Network to be better, or any of your affinity for artifact stuff like Serpent or the whatever, the Junker, the Black Rare, whatever affinity stuff you have. It's just sitting there for that. One of the things I love about it is it's an artifact for Hellish Sideswipe to sacrifice, the single black, like Bone Splinters variant, sack a creature artifact to kill a creature or vehicle. And it's an artifact to trade with Trade the Helm, which is, I know, a card you like that I've been like looking for, trying to include in more decks. Or Duretti, the red rare, like that's a nice thing to have that to sacrifice to get something back. So like, it's a card that you can get pretty much free in drafts. And if it's doing those things, I'd look for including it in your deck.
Yeah, I have not played many Guidelight Matrices. I think I've always been just on the side of like doesn't quite do enough. But
Mm-hmm.
that was pre Path Cruiser, and Path Cruiser is like 1,000% on my radar now. So
Yeah.
I'll be on the lookout for Guidelight Matrix as well. All right, talk to me about Pit Automaton. This is the last one on your list here.
I love this card so much. This is the 2 mana uncommon artifact. It's an 0/4. Taps to add 2 colorless just for activated abilities, and you can pay 2 tap to copy an exhaust ability. Choose new targets for the copy, whatever. I got to multiple times Splinter Twin people with this plus River Turn Monument, because that, like, They have 7 cards in their graveyard. Oh, double exhaust. Here's 7, mill 14. You're done, in one shot. But like, there's just a lot of places to put mana. Exhaust abilities, cycling. A lot of decks are interested in a 2 mana 0/4, honestly, like with how the format plays out. I think basically every blue deck wants this card, is how I feel currently. Plus, it's an
The
artifact. It's got types for your blue white deck, your blue black deck, whatever. Like, I think Pit Automaton stonks are on the rise for me.
I think its best home is in the Teamer exhaust decks. I think that's where it's most at home. I don't think it does enough in just artifact decks. I think you really want to be making use of the doubling exhaust triggers before you're thrilled with the card.
Fair, but like, how much? I mean, but your blue deck should be running Keen Buccaneers, Rangers Refuelers. Like, you don't need that much. I guess Rangers Refueler is not that good because it's just another counter on the thing. But like Keen Buccaneer, you get your double loot, whatever. Like, you don't need much to feel like you get the value from the doubled exhaust triggers. And I just feel like there's tons of places for that mana to go.
I agree, but the point I'm making is your artifact decks aren't happy to run Keen Buccaneer, I don't think.
No, yeah, I guess that's fair. I don't know. Maybe they should be. King Buccaneer should be on this list too. That card's really good. Like,
Well, I think that card's just good in general, which is why we probably
yeah.
haven't talked about it that much. I do think there is something to be said for that, which I think moves us on to our next card. And I think Keen Buccaneer also kind of belongs in this discussion. I think we do a thing, you and I, where when we agree on something, we just assume the rest of the world is on the same page as us.
And with this next card, they're definitely not.
They definitely are not.
Perhaps we need to clarify.
The next card is Momentum Breaker. 1 and a black for an uncommon enchantment. Start your engines. When it enters, your opponent sacrifices a creature or a vehicle. When they can't, they discard a card, and you can sacrifice it to gain life equal to your speed.
You misread it. It's when it enters, they sacrifice a Thopter or a pilot token.
Stop. We gotta stop doing that. That's the other thing we have to stop doing. Because I really took this feedback on YouTube to heart, which was, hey, like, fine that you guys disagree with the data on Momentum Breaker, and I like oftentimes like that you disagree with the data, but you gave me nothing about Momentum Breaker, about why it's good in the last episode. And I think we're so averse to doing that. I think because we feel like our defense mechanism is, at least certainly mine is to make fun of the data rather than like clearly articulate my points for cards like Momentum Breaker, and probably should err on the side of just clearly articulating my points for cards like Momentum Breaker. And if people don't like it, then they can shove off, but need to make sure that we clearly articulate why we like cards first.
Mm-hmm.
So for Momentum Breaker, I think the reason it is so high in my pick order is I'm viewing it as a linchpin card for a start your engines archetype. Like, it is premium in red black, and I think it's premium for several reasons. One, that deck's aggressive, so that you can force your opponent to trade things off, so it's more likely to nab something that isn't a pilot token or a Thopter token. The life gain matters in races. Like, once it hits, if you stick it and you're ticking your engines up, it basically says your opponent doesn't get to race. Like, they can't choose that avenue for the game because Momentum Breaker swings the race in your favor. And then in the hands of players who build their deck well and draft well and can navigate board states, there might be some turns where it's bad, but oftentimes you can navigate the game state to where it is getting, maybe it's not getting their best creature, but it's getting a creature. And the more work you do to try to attack and keep the board clear, the better this card gets.
Yeah, that was the thing I wanted to point out, which I didn't articulate last week, and I separately as well wanted to talk about Momentum Breaker, and appreciate the feedback that we got on YouTube and in our Discord. And like, yeah, bad on us, mea culpa, that we really, I think part of it was I felt like it was territory we had trotted already, but if we were going to spend so much time talking about Momentum Breaker, should have spent the time to talk about why. And that point is that when it's in my deck, I am thinking about trading off more aggressively. I'm thinking about trying to keep the board clear for that very reason. And what you're talking about, yes, there are definitely spots in the later turns of the game where it's dead. Like, if the board clogs out, and probably in black-green, it's at its worst, but I still would play it in black-green, most likely, because I think green decks are the culprit for a lot of board stalls in the format. But being able to have it on the first 5 turns of the game, I think is just, it's really easy, I think, to engineer a very mana efficient use of that card. And it plus Outpace Oblivion, the red 3 mana enchantment, are so good at that 1-2 punch that we're really interested in with Start Your Engines of play something, play a removal spell to clear their blocker, start my engines, and connect to get my speed up to 2. And Momentum Breaker does that great on whatever. If you play a 1-drop into it, if you play a 2-drop and then follow it up with Momentum Breaker, whatever, it just lets you do that 1-2 punch that the Start Your Engines decks really want to do.
Right. And I think a lot of the feedback we got last week, and rightly so, because I don't think we made a good case for the card, is
No.
that it's a sorcery speed edict. Of course, it's not in the top 10 game in hand win rates, uncommons, you dummies. And I think if you're viewing it as sorcery speed edict, I think you're looking at the card wrong. Because, like, I'll be the first person to say sorcery speed edict is not an intrinsically good Magic card.
Right.
But the upside on this, when you do stick it in those first few turns to tick your engines up to 2, like, enables a whole draft archetype for you. And the other piece of feedback we got about the card quite a bit that I want to try to debunk is that there's board stalls in the format. So an edict can't be good. Like, I would say you haven't played enough decks that aren't green if you think the format is all board stalls. Because,
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, when it's green deck versus green deck, the board stalls out a lot. But when it's a different archetype versus a green deck, the board's a lot less likely to stall, because either the synergy deck pops off and does things that are way more powerful than what the green deck is doing, or it doesn't pop off and the green deck stomps your throat in. Like, there's not much of a middle ground there in, like, the synergy deck versus green matchup. And so I don't subscribe to the theory that it's a board stall format. Like, I think you can build your decks, and that's what you're talking about with trading off and that sort of thing. Like, red
Mm-hmm.
black is not going to have the board stall out that much. Now, sometimes you draw Momentum Breaker and it sacks a Thopter or it sacks a Pilot or whatever, but I think you're willing to sign up for that for what it does for your deck and for what it does for an archetype. And it does have a very low floor, but it's also got an insanely high ceiling.
Yeah, I think that was, someone was like, how, because I think I did say, like, oh, it's the card with the highest floor we've seen. But no, people rightly pointed out its floor is Sorcery Speed Edict. They sack a Thopter, a Pilot token, whatever, something that doesn't matter. And
But
that
if
is
you're
pretty
likely to hit
bad.
that floor, you just built your deck wrong. Like, I think if you construct a red black deck correctly, you're
Mm-hmm.
very unlikely to hit the floor of the card.
I agree. I agree with that. I like the card. But I think it was worth us clarifying, and we should have just done it last week like good podcasters.
Yes. So thank you to that commenter on YouTube. It was a very well thought out comment. I appreciated it. Ride's End, we've talked about this card a fair amount this episode already, but I think this and Broadcast Rambler, which is the 5-mana 5/4 vehicle that comes with a Thopter and has a crew cost of 1, those are 2 good reasons to get into white at common. And I think as the format's shifting, and certainly in best of 3, there are good reasons to be white. I think as long as you're building white with the idea that you aren't trying to be aggro, I think white's totally fine.
Yes. I mean, I think that something you said about sealed last week has really just stuck with me in draft in general. As you saw my comment I made to you and talking about my deck at the end of this draft review was that, like, I couldn't beat a Ketradon. I just think you need to build, like, green exists and it is a big, like, focal point of the format. And I think you need to be building your decks with, like, what happens when I face Hazard of the Dunes and Migrating Ketradon? What do I do to beat those cards? And these 2 cards, Ride's End and Broadcast Rambler gives you 6 power across 2 bodies. Ride's End gives you a way to exile something, just get it done. Like, white has those tools at common and even higher, talking about the 1 in a white instant with cycling that destroys the thing with power or toughness 4 or greater. Like, the white has the tools, and these are 2 of the best ones.
Prowcatcher Specialist is another one that I've been impressed by this week, specifically in blue-red tempo decks. Not necessarily blue-red discard or cycling decks, but just blue-red get the game over with as quick as possible, oftentimes with some exhaust synergies. This is 1 in red for a 2/1 haste, and it's got exhaust 3 in a red to put 2+1/+1 counters on it. It just puts out a lot of damage in a hurry. Like, if you stumble at all, it's a great way. You were talking about, like, well, how do I make bounce off good offensively? Decks with Prowcatcher Specialist and the other good blue-red tempo cards. I think there's legs there.
Okay. Yeah. I have found the card tricky to deal with because you often want, like, what you want to do, like, let's say you've got a 2/3. Like, I often have the black surveyor, and you're like, well, I'll put that down on turn 3 so I can block it, and then they're like, okay, cool, untap, play a 4th land, and now I attack, and you're
And
like,
now there's threat of activation for the exhaust, but you don't want to block. But
right,
then they don't have to exhaust. Like, a lot of times it gets in 6 damage or something
yeah,
unopposed, and then can still be exhausted later. The threat of activation on the card has been impressive for me when opponents have gotten off to fast starts.
yes, I agree.
Next up, Spire Mech Cycle. This was a card I was pretty hot on in the set review, and I don't think we've really talked about it much since. This is the 4 in a red, 5/4 haste. It's got a crew cost of 2, and you can exhaust it by tapping another untapped mount or vehicle. And when you do, it gets a +1/+1 counter. Similar, this is a large vehicle that can attack into green cards, and I first played with this at Chicago when we did our Lords of Limited pod draft. Like, Samp just fed me 3 of these, and I kind of drafted my deck around them. But it works with itself, and it works well with the other red cards. You get Gilded Goda as a mount in red. I've just been fairly impressed with the card.
I haven't seen the card much on the battlefield, so I'll have to keep an eye out for it. Is it something feels like it's more of a backdoor thing, right?
Yeah,
Than
not a plan A, certainly, but like, what does red do? I mean, we're also going to talk about Push the Limit in a second, which
got
is a card
to.
I've been obsessed with this week, which is 5 red for a sorcery, return all mountain vehicle cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, sack them at the beginning of the next end step, and vehicles you control become artifact creatures until end of turn and gain haste until end of turn. This
It
is
says
just
win.
a
It's 7 mana win the game if you
7
build
mana
your
win the
deck
game,
right.
basically. But Spire Mech Cycle is a card you're also happy to play in your Ride the Index. And
Yes.
now that I've been on my Push the Limit decks, I've been base red way more than I ever have in the format, which has led me to play with Spire Mech Cycle and appreciate it as a card more than I
That
have.
checks out. You mentioning Gilded Goda brings me back to a point that Scotty brought up in that video we were chatting about earlier, which is that he really likes his 2-drops to either have 3 power or 3 toughness. That feels like the sweet spot, and I have really felt that. Like, Defour was like forcing Mardu decks in the format, and they were talking about Leonin Surveyor, which is the 1 and a white 2-drop, start your engines, has first strike on your turn, etc. But that card just gets bricked a lot of the time, and it's actually much better as a blocker because then you can, whatever, you double block with it, blah, 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 and it doesn't feel that bad because eventually you'll get to cash it in for a card once you get your speed up to 4. And I have definitely built some bad aggro decks in the format with Leonin Surveyor, and then your opponent plays Wicker Folk or the blue one and a blue 1/3 flyer with exhaust, and like, you're just like, what am I doing with this garbage card in my deck? And I feel kind of similarly about Gilded Goda. I guess Gilded Goda bounces off the 1/3s and you can get a treasure, and that's a little bit better, but like, 2 power 2-drops have felt bad in the format.
I agree, but I think it's worth it in tandem with Spire Mech Cycle, and is also a mount that Push the Limit brings back.
Sure.
That's where it's been happening for me. Like, I just put all that stuff together this week.
Yeah. Well, let's chat about these cards and then get to Push the Limit, because I want to talk about how mounts fit into that deck for you.
So Guide-like Pathmakers up next for white blue for 6/5 vigilance, uncommon vehicle with a crew cost of 2, and it lets you tutor up an artifact, which frequently you have some banger artifacts to go get in this format. I think I've been too low on this card because I haven't played white. Like, I really haven't played white hardly at all because I've been so in love with Grixis in the first couple weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now that big white is on my radar, like,
Yeah,
Guide-like Pathmaker is really good in those big white decks.
I totally agree. I think for Pathmaker, obviously you just want bangers to search up. And can we, like, Spike Shell Harrier? I think that gets my vote right now for best uncommon in the set. The 4 and a blue, 4/4, bounce a thing, reduce their speed. Like, that was just such the deck I qualified for in day 1 of the open. Like, I opened my pool. I didn't have like any removal. The removal I had in my deck was like, or interaction, I should say, in my deck was like bounce off. I did have Boom Mobile, the rare vehicle, which pulled its weight. I think maybe a lightning strike. Sky Crash was an overperformer, the 1 in a red shatter with red cycling. But like, Spike Shell Harrier just did a ton of work. So obviously that's a great artifact to be able to tutor up with the Pathmaker. But I do think you also want to make sure you have something that can crew it like something, a 2-drop that you can, if you need to. You're like, yeah, I would love to get Spike Shell Harrier, but what I actually need to do is just grab something that can crew this, put it into play so that I now have a 6/5 at the ready to be crewed. So that
Yeah,
does, when you're drafting this card and building your deck, just make sure you have something like that to go search up.
that's a good shout. And last on my list, I just keep being impressed by this card. I have not cast it yet, and that is probably on me. It's Veteran Beast Rider, 1 green white for a 3/4 uncommon. At the beginning of your end step, untap each creature you control, and you can pay 4 mana, 2 green white, to give your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. It was a house in sealed, and I was very impressed with it in sealed, but I also just lost to it in draft this week too. Like, I think this is the type of
It's
card in those big white decks that it's just outstanding. Like 3/4 for 3 mana, and then when you play your 4th land drop, it's threatening to attack as a 4/5. It's just gigantic when it hits the board on turn 3.
I think something that I haven't come around to that I should, that I like, I'm just starting to, again, probably too late, that this is very splashable in those big
Yeah.
white decks. Like that if you are Mardu or Esper, like try and get some green sources in there too for your Beast Rider. One of the things I was thinking about, I was like, well, but it's gonna be, if it's a splash, it's so hard to cast and activate in the same turn. It's hard to get to double activations in the same turn. But I'm not even sure that that's true if you've got night markets, if you've got dual lands, if you've got starting columns. Like, I think you can get there. And I'm also not sure that you need to. I think 1 activation is probably good enough.
1 activation is good enough for sure, I think. And the other thing that's so impossible about it is, like, you start doing the math and you're like, well, if they activate, okay, like, I'm willing to throw these creatures away to push some damage. Like, I think it's actually a better defensive card than it is an offensive card, but it makes you hold up mana. And then if your opponent has Ride's End, you're just so totally hosed. Like, if they have Ride's End instead of
Right.
this, like when you're trying to push damage, like there's this
Yeah.
guessing game of, is this just the activation or do they also have Ride's End? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm very impressed with Veteran Beast Rider this week.
Yeah. It's very good. All right. It's time. We're going to
Time to
push it
push
to
the
the
limit.
limit. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I've been on this card since losing to a great version of this deck. And like the first week, I remember I talked about it in conjunction with Monument to Endurance. I faced that and I was like, oh, this is real. I don't even know if you need Monument to Endurance for the deck to work. Like, Push the Limit it's real. And I like, the cat's out of the bag. Like, everybody knows about this deck already. But I think it's still worth talking about because it's a really sweet deck.
I don't know if everybody knows about it. I feel like I'm pretty plugged in and draft quite a bit. I mean, maybe not as much as I used to. I was a little bit busier, but I just drafted this deck for the first time this week and then promptly forced it like 3 or 4 times after I did it the first time.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think there's certainly people, if you've been on the Green Life or whatever, I bet there's half our listeners or something who've never drafted a Push the Limit deck or more.
Yeah. All right. Well, so talk to me about the Push the Limit deck.
So it's a build around for sure. I think it's typically red white, but you can be red X or even do like red white soup stuff if you also subscribe to the big white stuff as a great home for Push the Limit. If you've got starting columns and you've got your Marshall's Path Cruisers to help you splash, so you can definitely go deep. But the deck is basically, you're making great use of cards that typically wheel. So I think you
Yes.
can force the deck if you want to have fun, but the deck is significantly less good if you're spending higher picks on key cards like Push the Limit or the cycling vehicles. So there's some bread and butter cycling vehicles that kind of make the deck tick.
Right. So Clamorous Ironclad and Skybox Fairy, I think, are the 2 at the top of the heap. So Clamorous Ironclad is the 6/3 menace for 3 in a red and has cycling for single red. And Skybox Fairy is the 5 mana 4/4 flying vehicle with cycling for 2 colorless. Both of those cards, Ironclad less so because I think blue red cycling picks that up even without Push the Limit. But Skybox Fairy, like, that is filler minus in the format, unless you're in Push the Limit. And the other thing about, and we'll talk about some more vehicles, but the other thing that those 2 vehicles do is they're so good with Push the Limit as being just end the game, because 4/4 flyer and 6/3 menace are actually kind of hard to block in the format.
Yeah, very difficult to block. And then the other thing, like, this is, we said Zenith Flare was in the format Haunted Network. It's
Haunt the Network.
actually
Yeah.
push the limit because you like the cycling cards are
Yeah.
similar to Zenith Flare in that like you dig, and they're helping you find the push the limit. And yeah, Zenith Flare costs 7, but it's still pretty cool to be able to like cycle, find your push the limit, and then vomit all these vehicles onto the battlefield. If you've not won with
Yeah.
push the limit yet, it's a very satisfying way to win a game of Magic. There's some other ones that are less common. Detention Chariot is great in the red-white version because it's got cycling for a single white. That's the 6/6 O-ring vehicle. Thundering Broodwagon is outstanding at uncommon because you can cycle it for 2 mana, and then when it ETBs, like you still get to blow something power 4 or mana value 4 or less when you cast push the limit. So that's great. It also animates your Marshal's Path Cruiser the turn that you push the limit if you haven't traded it off yet. Yeah, I've been very impressed with the push the limit decks. You can also go deeper if you want with some random vehicle or mount splashes if you have enough of the red discard effects. So kickoff celebrations, the one in a red, discard a card, draw 2 cards, and then also Thunderhead Gunner. We probably haven't talked about this card enough. This card is just outstanding in the format. 4 in a red,
Yeah.
4/5, reach, discard a card, draw a card.
Remember when
Activate
I was
only as a
telling you that
sorcery.
this is better than Lightning Strike, and you were like, "Oh, I don't know if I can make that."
I'm
I
making
don't
that
make
call.
that.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe you've talked about it enough. Maybe I've just been slow on the uptake. Thunderhead Gunner
Yep.
is the truth.
Thunderhead Gunner is nuts. I mean, so I certainly after your foray into sealed, like Thunderhead Gunner is nuts in sealed, and it's just
Yeah, you're
also
supposed to splash for Thunderhead Gunner and sealed, like aggressively splash for Thunderhead Gunner.
the other card you don't have this list that is also red discard is the Grease Wrench Goblin. That can
Ooh,
also
yeah.
be in that package of you pitching vehicles. Where are you at on like? Do you start to run tune up the 3 and a white? Reanimate an artifact, and if it's a vehicle, it becomes a creature. Slash back on track, the 4 and a black, reanimate a creature or vehicle and make a pilot token. Like, are those making their way into your push the limit decks as well?
Sometimes not. It just depends on if I have room because there is a lot of air in the decks already. And tune up as a 4 mana 6/3 menace is not always good enough. So I think it has been deck dependent for me.
Well, and that brings us the lot of air thing brings us to this next point about land counts.
Yeah, so you want to run a lower land count than normal because presumably, like if you have a good version of the deck, you probably have 3 to 4 Clamorous Ironclads and then a couple Skybox Fairies. So I think I've been treating it like we did back in Ikoria, where once I have 6 Cyclers or whatever, I'm shaving 2 lands because you're almost always cycling all of your vehicles.
Yeah, so like the common wisdom in Ikoria was for every 3 cards that had a cycling cost of 1, you could cut a land. And then there's some fudging that happens when you get into the cycling cost of 2. But yeah, stuff like Ironclads and Detention Chariots, those can really lower your land count quite a bit.
Which is weird because you need to get to 7 mana for push the limit, which is not nothing. So initially I was reluctant to shave tons of lands, and the more I did it, 15 felt like the normal sweet spot, I think, and I've gone 14 once, but I had like tons of cyclers in that deck.
Yeah.
Like we're talking 10, 11, 12 cyclers in that version of the deck. But I think 15 is a good, assuming you've got like 3 to 4 Clamorous Ironclads and some other cyclers, I think 15 is a pretty good number.
I think also if the more Thunderhead Gunners you have, I think the less you are interested in shaving lands because you really want to get to 5 mana on time, and like that red card selection. The more of those I have, the more I'm interested in like, well, I know that once I hit my land drops, I can pitch the excess lands to these effects, and the less of those I have, then I'm more interested in trying to shave lands when I can.
That checks out, yeah. So the deck operates basically like a control deck. It's like red white control or Boros control or insert whatever color pair you happen to be control with some pretty inevitable late game. Like push the limit is oftentimes win the game when you cast it.
Yeah.
And then those cyclers dig you towards push the limits. They help you find your win con. You really want to push the limit for the deck to be premium. The one does not quite cut it in my experience.
Okay. I don't think that's true. The decks I've had have only had one, and I've liked it.
And you're all in on push the limit, or you have a functional deck outside of push the limit package?
I guess I have a functional deck outside of push the limit package because I think almost exclusively done it as blue red. It's blue red splash, but I've done it with Monument to Endurance. So I've had like a deck that wants to be cycling and how it gets to be cycling is through the vehicles, and then it wants push the limit because there's a bunch of vehicles in the graveyard.
So it sounds like you've arrived in the deck responsibly more than I have.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. For now, I foresee some irresponsible drafting in my future.
So there are some extra sweet cards you can get for this deck. First is Thopter Fabricator, which is just bonkers. It's 2 and a blue for the 4/4 flying vehicle, and when you draw your second card each turn, you make a 1/1 Thopter. It's just everything you already want to do for Thopter Fabricator. It just juices up your push the limit deck.
Well, and what's really nice is that Thopter Fabricator has such a target on its back from your opponents, and you get away, like, if you're running it with Tune Up or Back on Track and obviously Push the Limit, like, you get ways to get it back.
Yes. I had a very spicy red-black version with Crypt Caller Chariot as well, which lines up super nicely. It's the 3 and a black 5/5 vehicle with Menace. And when you discard one or more cards, you make that many tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. Why do these zombies come into play tapped? This card would be such a good build around if they came in untapped.
It has real Rise from the Tides energy every time I play it.
It's just one more turn, it does. Definitely has Rise from the Tides vibes. That's what I was thinking the last time I had it in this red-black deck. But it's very fun with Push the Limit.
Yeah.
Explosive Getaway is also a great home for this card. Probably the best home for this card, which is the 3 red-white Wrath. Exile up to 1 target artifact creature, return to the battlefield under owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and it deals 4 damage to each creature. The other place this card is great is in those big white decks.
That's what I was just going to say. I think this is just a good, I think this is a card we were underrating. This was in, I forget which feature draft it was, maybe Javier's feature draft last week. He had it pack 1, pick 2 when he took Broadcast Rambler, and we didn't even shout it out. I think we were focusing so much on the Momentum Breaker that was in that pack that we wanted him to take. And we got some feedback about, well, what about Explosive Getaway? And I think I'm Ride's End into Explosive Getaway that's a good start to a draft too.
I agree. And I think that was prior to these big white decks being on my radar. And I think once you accept white is big, then I think it gets a lot more appealing.
Yeah, for sure.
You already shouted Monument to Endurance. That card is absurd with Push the Limit. Valor's Flagship is a super sick mythic rare that you can get. That's the 4 white 7/7 vehicle with Flying First Strike lifelink. And you can cycle it for 2 and a white and X to make pilots. That card is incredible with Push the Limit. And then Salvation Engine, also another mythic. 4 and a white for the 6/10 crew 6. Gives your artifact creatures +2/+2. And whenever it attacks, you can return an artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield. I had Salvation Engine in my day 1 arena sealed pool. I had such a fun day 1 sealed pool.
You copied it with Mendicant, right?
I copied it with Mendicant, the blue-white rare. Yeah,
that's insane.
My deck was nuts. I had triple Packdoll Terror to tick up my speed for the Mendicants. Had Haunt the Network. That deck was everything I want to do in the format. It was 4 color, not green. No, it was green. I had an Earth Rumbler and the mount, this 4/2 rare, the green-white rare.
Oh, yeah. The one that tutors up.
The one that tutors up a mount or a vehicle, yeah.
Yeah.
And it could tutor up Salvation Engine, which was real nice.
That's gross. That's so gross. That card's excellent. That's another, that's the thing is a lot of, no one wants, we're talking about big white, and maybe we'll just dive into big white next week a little bit more. But one of the things that white gets is a lot of these cards that does red white want to play Explosive Getaway? Well, red white aggro certainly doesn't, but if you're just big white splashing, you'll get it. Maybe there's not a green white drafter at the table, but you can get your veteran beast callers and splash it. You can get the whatever Caldora and splash it. And white gets a lot of those gold cards that maybe not the single deck wants it, but you can splash it in those big white decks.
Yeah, in our Lords of Limited basement draft that we did at the end of the con, Sam had, I think, a big white deck, and I passed him a wheeled Gear Hulk, I think, a green-white Gear Hulk that he was then able to play because he was big white. And I was like, nobody's green-white if this made it this far around the table. Nope. Sam got it in there. He had 2 copies of the green-white Gear Hulk in his deck. It was nice.
I know it's a good episode when we're finished recording and I'm bummed that I have to edit rather than draft. And that's how I feel right now. I'm ooh, I kind of want to go and open a Ride's End. If I had that arena open draft now, I think I would take Ride's End over the Thrill Seeker.
That's why I was on Ride's End. Because I had just the big white decks had just started to click for me in the last couple days. But I will see in my draft, to tease a little bit for Lords Unlimited here, we're going to go over my draft. I had a very similar pack one pick one to Javier. My pack one pick one choices is Wreckage Wickerfolk versus Ride's End.
Yeah, kind of want to take Ride's End now,
I
don't I?
kind of want to take Ride's End. I chickened out and I took Wickerfolk. Like I'm way more comfortable drafting black decks than I
Uh-huh.
am the big white deck. So I took Wickerfolk because I wanted to be black red or blue black, if I'm being honest with myself.
Yeah.
But I think it's a close pick, and I certainly, like, prior to having this epiphany the last 3 days or whatever, would never take Ride's End over Wickerfolk. And I think it's a really close pick now, and kind of up to whichever style of deck you want to
Yeah.
draft.
Yeah, for sure. Oof. Like, I think it's clear from how we've been podcasting about it, but this format is awesome. I really like this format.
I enjoy it as well. It's very cool. It's super deep. Honestly, I think green being as dominant as it is, it makes the format interesting, more interesting almost. Like it forces
There's a clear boogeyman, I think.
a clear boogeyman, and it's unique in ways that formats have not been. Like that the aggro decks don't quite get there, and then figuring out that white is, well, maybe white works if it's bigger, or that sort of
Mhm.
thing. There's been a lot of dominoes that have fallen over the last few weeks, which has been cool to see.
For sure.
Yeah, I definitely want to go draft now.
Yeah.
All right, let's wrap it up there. Thank you, as always, to Salty Pretzels for our intro and outro music. Make sure you give it a listen.
You can find all of our content at lordsoflimited.com. There's links to our tier list. Maybe Ride's End will be up in the A range if you go check that out. But we've also got links to our YouTube channel, our Twitch streams, respectively, our episode backlogs, our merch, courtesy of TeePublic, and our Patreon page. All of that's at lordsoflimited.com.
If you've got any feedback about the show or any questions, shoot us an email at lordsoflimited@gmail.com.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week for another episode of Lords of Limited.
Thanks, everybody. See you later.